Okay, so this is brain-based interventions for attachment and developmental trauma. So we're going to be talking about neurotherapy, neurofeedback, and qEEGs. I am your presenter, Scott Kennecke, and I am the owner of Neuro-Empathic Counseling. My background, for those of you who haven't seen the first two webinars, is that I am trained in trauma, neurofeedback, quantitative electroencephalograph, qEEG, and brain maps, which is what we're going to talk about today. Brain spotting. I have a mental health degree, master's in mental health. I'm a licensed practicing counselor. I am a senior fellow with the Biofeedback Certification International Alliance, which is just kind of the gold standard for neurofeedback and neurotherapies. I used to work at a long-term residential facility for complex developmental trauma for about 7.5 years. There I primarily worked with preteens and also all the way up to young adults, so about, 8, 9 to 22, somewhere around there, 23. During that period of time, I also worked with the employees at this facility because of something called vicarious traumatization and compassion fatigue, which is to say that when you work with trauma as a helping professional, it's very, very possible that you can also be triggered by that trauma. And so one of the main important things is to get your own help when you're working in that field. So we opened up this clinic that was predominantly working with adults as well. I specialize in something called DDP, which is dyadic developmental psychotherapy. And oh, okay, sorry, I just got a prompt to bring somebody in. So DDP is dyadic developmental psychotherapy. It's really one of the main interventions for working with trauma. It's about helping people with trauma to really to establish and develop a sense of value, because a lot of times when you go into that survival state, you lack a sense of value, and so it becomes very important in therapy to help the person to establish that. Okay. So we're going to talk. So today we're going to be talking about neurofeedback, qEEG, brain-based interventions. This is probably by far one of my favorite topics to talk about. This is what I've been doing for the past 20 odd years. I started way back in St. I came from St. Louis. If anyone's familiar with St. Louis, way back when I was just a young kid. And this particular video that I'm going to share with you is just quite amazing. So this comes from a laboratory called Neuroscape, and it's in UCSF. And what they basically did here is they took what's called a tensors diffusion MRI, which is a brain scan that allows you to see the water molecules travel across nerve fibers. So it gives you a really interesting picture of the brain. And what they've done is that they've collaborated with a company called NVIDIA, which probably some of you know, works with graphics cards. But they developed this wonderful 3D model of the brain, and they took the tensors diffusion MRI and they created this wonderful 3D model. And then what's just incredible about this is they took what's called a 64-channel qEEG, which is, we're going to get into what a qEEG stands for in a minute here, and they recorded the electrical activity of the brain, and they transposed that electrical activity of the brain onto the 3D model. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing the electrical activity of the brain in real time travel down these nerve fibers. Just really cool. And just to kind of add in an additional neat factor, that particular laboratory used virtual reality. So this person right here, this model is someone actually in a virtual environment exploring their own brain in real time with the qEEG on. So just, if very, very meta there. Um, so the point of this really is that qEEG it stands for quantitative electroencephalograph, which is the brain map, is recording the electrical activity. So qEEG stands for quantitative, which is multiple different points. Electro is electricity, and cephala is brain, and graph is picture. So really what we're trying to do with the EEG and the qEEG brain map is get an electric brain picture. So what that looks like is this. So some of you might be familiar about who this person is, but the qEEG looks like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to prepare just kind of prepare the skin. We don't want any oils or any dead skin cells to get onto or to kind of impede on the recording itself. But what we're going to do is we're going to put on this cap, looks something like this. So this is something that you would do like if you were going to go to a sleep study, although sleep studies use individual sensors, they don't use caps like this. Or if you were going to get an evaluation to determine if you had some type of seizure activity. So the qEEG is used in the medical field quite often. So this is what it looks like. So if you were coming in for a brain map, or if you're going to do neurotherapy with a practitioner around you, this would be the initial assessment, and it would look something like this. Now, what we're doing here is we're getting all the electrical activity, and then that's going to give us a brain map. So this is going to be the main assessment tool that I use for, if I'm evaluating whether or not an intervention was successful, determining, what type of neurofeedback protocols I'm going to use, and we'll get into what neurofeedback is and how that works. And so the brain map, what it does is it's essentially taking that electrical picture that we recorded, and usually we record about 6 minutes of eyes open and eyes closed. It's taking that electric picture and it's comparing it to a normative database. So someone went out and recorded about 1,400 brains, and then divided it up into different developmental stages. So essentially, an infant's brain is going to look very much different than an adult brain or an elder's brain. So the scans are divided into these different age brackets, and then they're divided into different frequency bands. So when we talk about electricity, we can actually look at slow wave frequencies, or we can look at fast wave frequencies. We can actually break the electrical signal into different parts. So here in this brain map, you're seeing these 5 different head maps. Each one of these head maps is going to be connected to a different frequency, which is going to take that raw electrical signal and break it into different bands. And they go from slow to fast. So here's a slow wave, which is called delta, and then here's theta, here's alpha, and they're going to progressively get faster as they go from left to right. So alpha, beta, and high beta. So what we've done is we can compare your nervous system to a normative database, and then we see how your brain differs from the norm, so the statistical norm or your peers. So so when we look at these maps, when we see the colorations, we see red, or we see yellow, or we see blue, or we see dark blue, what that essentially means is that compared to your peers, you're either producing too much of that frequency, or you're not producing enough of that frequency. And the value of too much or too little is really based on really the microvolt value. So how much power that frequency is producing. So when we see the red, or if we see the yellow, basically what that means is that person is producing too much of that. And yellow basically means they're producing an incredibly large amount of that. So to give you kind of an idea of that, we measure this in standard deviation. And so if you were to take an intelligence exam and you were in the norm, 1 standard deviation plus means that you're intelligent. Okay, you got a good head on your shoulders. 2 standard deviation means you're a genius. You process really quickly. You could figure things out. You can do complex problem solving. 3 standard deviations means that you're a super genius. You're kind of like a Newton or an Einstein or something like that. So when you see the yellow like that, this means that that's 3 standard deviations. Or when you see the dark blue, that means 3 standard deviations. So when I see a scan and I see this dark, or this dark blue or this yellow, that's a very telltale sign for me to really look at that frequency and compare that to the person's symptoms or their defense structures. So really what we're going to be looking for is we're going to be looking for 3 things. We're going to be looking for just neurological adaptations, which is to say that not everybody's brain is going to be statistically average. In most cases, people generally have some deviation, but not all deviations are necessarily problematic. So like I said in the previous example, if you have a high intelligence, that would be considered a deviation. If you have high music performance, or if you have high intuition, all of those are going to be considered deviations. Now, with that said, most of the people that I see, especially when I was working with complex developmental trauma, they're in a very defense they're in that survival mode, and because they're in that survival mode, most of their deviations are going to be related to their defense mechanisms or their symptoms. So earlier in the one of the previous webinars, we talked about trauma being survival. So survival is really about enacting defense structures. So like distractibility can be a defense structure, disassociation can be a defense structure, addiction, excessive self-concerning, all these particular symptoms can be defenses. So when we look at these elevations and deficits in the brain, that's what I'm trying to find out. And then secondarily, because of something called neuroplasticity, which is to say that what wires together, what fires together wires together, we know that if you engage in a particular defense for a prolonged period of time, that the nervous system will just begin to develop the hardware to support that particular defense. Neuroplasticity isn't good or bad. All it does is it follows what you do. So the more that you engage in a particular defense structure, let's say distractibility or disassociation or anxiety, the more that the brain will support that by helping it develop neurological systems or kind of hardware, if you will, to support those particular systems. So I'm looking for symptoms, I'm looking for defense mechanisms to give me clues about how to train this person, neurotherapy, also clues about what to do in terms of therapy or psychotherapy, and in some cases, even working with them in terms of their sensory regulation or kind of managing their sensory systems. Okay, so I'm going to dive a little bit into the frequencies here. So we've got this delta, this theta, this alpha, the beta, the high beta. And each one of these frequencies is going to be connected to a different system, a different function, a different process. So we'll start with delta. So delta frequencies are really about sleep. So if you go into a sleep study and they put a qEEG on your head, what they're really wanting to look at is they want to look at REM, which is actually a beta frequency, but they also really want to look at delta frequency. Is your brain producing delta? And the specific term is something called the K complex. So what happens when we get into deep sleep is we produce a lot of delta, and delta shuts the brain off. So all of your sensory systems are shut down, and it allows a lot of those resources that otherwise be going into paying attention to the world around you. It allows those resources now to go into renewing, restoring, repairing, reorganizing, restructuring, so information allocation. So all these things that the brain needs to do in order to really integrate the previous day happens during sleep. And really the delta frequency really is a main modulator of that system. The reason that I have this infant on here is because infants produce a lot of delta. So if I was to put a sensor on an infant and just measure their brain, chances are most of what they produce is going to be delta. Everybody probably knows that infants sleep a lot. Okay, the next one, theta. So theta is the next one. Theta really has to do with daydreaming or our orientation of attention. So what am I paying attention to? Am I paying attention to kind of the inside world, like my thoughts, my fantasies, my dreams? Am I paying attention to, just my internal dialogue and feelings? Or am I externally motivated or aware? I'm paying attention to, someone just passed my window, or I'm hyper focused on emailing, or I'm engaged in some task that's externally oriented. I'm having a conversation with someone. So when we have low theta, when the brain decreases its theta, we're focusing on the external. When it increases theta, we're really focusing on the internal. So some of you might be familiar with something called float spas, or they call them sensory deprivation tanks. There are these tanks that you go into and you float on them, and you're kind of depriving yourself of audio and visual information. It's dark and there's low sound. So when you go into these tanks, what's happening is that you're depriving yourself of sensory information, and you're forcing the brain to go into an internal state, into even like a meditative state. And so what happens here is that theta increases. A lot of times you'll start to experience like daydreaming, or you're kind of like a dreamlike, what we call a hypnagogic state. So all sorts of things happen in this theta state. Another example of theta would be right before you go to sleep, as you're kind of falling into sleep and you might kind of hear voices or see images or something like that. That's theta. Okay, the reason I have a toddler here is because actually these frequencies tend to correlate with developmental stages. So toddlers tend to produce a lot of theta. Theta is also going to be connected to sensory regulation. So this is, for a toddler, this has to do with their, learning about their senses, somatosensory stage. So they're kind of engaging the world and getting into all sorts of stuff. Okay, so alpha. Alpha is really about creating a calm, neutral state. So anybody who does any meditation practices, anybody who does yoga or progressive relaxation or anything like that, really what they're trying to do is they're trying to activate this alpha frequency because alpha really puts the brain into a neutral or calm state. So people who do like Zen practices, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to get their alpha to go up. So, a neurological example of this would be when we close our eyes. So when we close our eyes, the visual cortex, the back of the head, what it does is it activates an alpha frequency because we're no longer utilizing our occipital lobe, our visual cortex, unless you're looking at the back of your eyelids. So if you notice when you close your eyes, that your eyeballs kind of shut down. You're not really processing light, you're not really processing the image, you're not really looking at your eyelids because that would be really a waste of resources. Now, with that said, and I'll just more to come on this, a lot of times when people don't produce alpha in their visual cortex when they close their eyes, that's usually an indication of something like PTSD because the eyes are not turning off when you close your eyes. And that usually is an indication of anxiety or fear or worry about the external environment. So I want to keep my eyes on just in case I need to open my eyes real quick. All right. Beta. Oh, the beloved beta. This is going to be our focused frequency. So when you're engaging in some type of task, when you're listening to a radio broadcast or a podcast, or you're engaging in an email or something like that, really beta is going to be focused concentration. So your ability to maintain your focus for long periods of time is really going to be your beta. Now, some people might say that high beta is really the thing that we all want. This is going to be multitasking. So when we're trying to do a bunch of things all at once, typically high beta frequencies are going to activate and engage. We're going to try to, manage, 4 or 5 things at once. Um, High beta also is related to emergency states. So, for example, if your best friend is on the precipice of a cliff and you want to try to get to them as quickly as you can, you're going to use every resource in your brain to get to them. So you're going to multitask. Another example would be if you were kind of, let's say you're going into like a store, like a mall or something, like during the holiday seasons, and there's just tons of people everywhere, and you're trying to navigate through that space. And so you're using your sensory systems to navigate. You might have a couple people with you, and so maybe you're engaged in conversation, but you're also trying to make decisions. Where do we go next? Maybe you have a child, that child keeps running off, and so you're trying to grab that child. So really high beta is about multitasking and using a lot of resources. Typically, you don't really want to stay in this state for too long because it will exhaust the system. It uses a lot of resource. So you want to be in this kind of state for short periods of time. That's really what it's designed to do. All right. All right, so a couple of the metrics I want to talk about. So when we do brain scans, not only are we getting that normative data about the frequencies, so we're determining if delta's too high or theta's too low or beta's too high, something like that. If you don't have enough beta, it might be difficult for you to concentrate. If you have too much theta, you might just kind of be distracted all the time. If you have too much delta during your waking state, you might be sleepy and fatigued and exhausted. But we have a couple of other metrics that I want to talk about. These are also things that we measure in the qEEG scan. So dominant frequency is one that we look at. And dominant frequency really it's a measurement of how fast your brain is going. So is it going too fast or is it going too slow? And so a lot of times when the brain is going too slow, it impacts our mood and it impacts our focus. So we feel inhibited or we feel under aroused, meaning we don't have enough energy to focus on things. We might feel sluggish. We might feel kind of, just kind of lazy if we're under aroused. So that really, makes it difficult to focus. It also inhibits us. So we might not feel like we're really engaged in situations. The best example of this would be like passive aggressiveness. So if I'm having a conversation with someone and they say something to me that maybe they're being facetious or maybe they're just being playful or something, and they say something like, "Oh man, your nose is big" or something. I don't know, just something random. And if I'm inhibited, and let's say I get my feelings hurt. So I get my feelings hurt, they say something about my nose. If I'm inhibited, what I'm not gonna do is I'm not gonna say, "Hey, when you just said that thing about my nose, were you being serious or were you being playful?" What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna internalize that. I'm gonna disengage from the conversation. I'm gonna think about it. Oh man, when so and so said that about my nose, that was really hurtful. How dare they? And so I'm gonna ruminate and I'm gonna worry. I'm gonna, kind of perseverate on that. And the next time I see that person, I might be passive aggressive to them, or in some cases, I might be just aggressive to them. So being inhibited really, what it does is it makes it so that you don't really allow yourself to be engaged in what's going on around you. So you don't really have a very good clarity about what's happening interpersonally or what's happening from day to day. So it impacts our mood. Also, if your brain is too fast, what typically happens is we get into what's called overarousal. And overarousal basically means that we have a hard time, relaxing. We might be really impatient. We might be engaged in conversation and we might already know what the person's going to say. So we just kind of want to like egg them on and just kind of all right, get over what you're saying. Like, I need to go. There's typically this kind of really just an impatience that goes with it and almost kind of a rude way of being with other people because you just kind of want to get going and move on. Okay. So interconnectivity, this is really looking at how the brain communicates with itself. So we've got two metrics here. We've got hypoconnectivity and hyperconnectivity. And so hypoconnectivity is a measurement of how independent the brain is working. What that means is if you've got the frontal lobes working independently of the parietal lobes, well, that's actually a problem because they're not sharing information. And so it's almost as though they're doing separate things. And so a lot of times when we see hypoconnectivity, and we see that biomarker pop up, usually it's an indication of things like fetal alcohol syndrome or concussion or some type of traumatic brain injury. So when one area of the brain is just not connected to other areas of the brain, it means that typically you'll lose functionality, but also you may have these people might have like kind of different personalities almost. Not kind of the what you'd expect with multiple personalities, but like they might be one moment they're one way and the next moment that they're the other way. They also might have difficulties with task completion, which is to say like if a certain area of the brain is disconnected from everything else, then what it does is it becomes kind of like an area of congestion. So to give you an example, let's say I'm working with a kid and the parents, regularly ask that child to take out the trash. Okay, so hey, I need you to take out the trash. They've agreed that that's a chore this child does. Okay, so if that child has hypoconnectivity, what that means is that they may be hearing what their parents are saying, right? So they might internalize that, they might understand, they might interpret it and put meaning to it. Okay, my mom wants me to take out the trash. Okay, I got that. Now, if there's a disconnect between the part of the brain that interprets that information and the frontal lobes, which is the part of the brain that figures out the steps that you need to take and prioritizes your time and makes the decision to do it, and then ultimately sends that to the motor cortex to execute that particular sequence of events. Well, then what happens is they hear their mom say, take out the trash, and they say, yeah, okay, I got that. I'll take care of that. But because it never goes to the frontal lobes, they never make a decision, and because they may never make a decision, they never get around to do it. So the parent might come back and they might say, "Hey, I told you to take out the trash. Why didn't you do that?" And so the kid says, "Well, I just forgot. I'm sorry." And so the parent might take that personally. Ah, you're not a responsible kid, and you never listen, and might say some things like that. But the reality is that the information didn't go to the frontal lobes to follow through with that task. So that becomes a really important metric to evaluate to determine if a child or an adult or someone has the ability for task completion. Now, hyperconnectivity is a different story. Hyperconnectivity is the opposite. This means that the brain is working too kind of codependently. It hasn't differentiated. And so what I mean by differentiation is that let's take an infant for example. They when they're first kind of learning their movements, they have these what we call gross motor skills. They flail their arms around. They might kind of hit themselves in the face. They might every once in a while get their thumb in their mouth. So they're kind of learning how to use their muscles. At some point, they start to develop fine motor skills, which is to say that they start to use their individual digits. They start to allocate their digits, their finger digits, to different parts of the brain. So different parts start taking on those responsibilities. And so what's happening is that the brain is differentiating. It's becoming more complex. It's becoming more capable of using different systems and different functions. And so when we see hyperconnectivity, it basically means that there's a lack of differentiation. The nervous system hasn't differentiated, which means there's going to be potentially delays in development. Now, symptomatically, what we see with delays of development is we see a lot of stubbornness, we see a lot of rigidity. This is a person that is kind of using the same um, problem solving skills over and over again, despite the fact that those problem solving skills don't work. It's your essentially, I see the world as a nail because I only have a hammer. Um, there's a difficulty with kind of malleability or seeing outside of the box when we have this hyperconnectivity. A lot of the developmental, complex developmental kids have this hyperconnectivity. Okay. All right, asymmetry. This is probably one of the most useful metrics that I would say, especially with developmental trauma. And the reason that this is really, really useful metric is because this is our measurement of depression. And so what this is measuring is it's literally measuring the power output of the left hemisphere compared to the right. And what I mean by power is I mean by the microvolt value, so the voltage, if you will. So we can measure the left hemisphere and we can see, okay, left hemisphere is producing 5 microvolts. We can measure right hemisphere and that's producing 30 microvolts. Okay, so if the right hemisphere is producing 30 and the left is producing 5, we have asymmetry, meaning that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have different power outputs. A lot of times when there's a difference in power output, you get symptoms because the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are not communicating. They don't have enough energy, literally, to communicate. So with asymmetry, we can look at two frequency bands. We look at the alpha and we look at the beta. So over here on the left, we have normal alpha asymmetry. And when this is in the red, it means that there's a lot of alpha in the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is producing a bunch of alpha. And alpha, as we know earlier, is about neutral or shutting down or going into a neutral state. So if you've got a bunch of alpha in your left hemisphere, what's typically happening is that all the functions of that are going to be neutralized. And the left hemisphere has a couple functions. One, it has to do with social engagement, and social engagement is the idea of like, so my mom calls me up and she says, "Hey, come to uh, come to holiday dinner," or something like that. So she lives in St. Louis and I live in Lake of the Ozarks, so I'm about 2.5 hours away. So if I struggle with social engagement, my reaction to that might be, "Oh man, this is going to be terrible. I'm going to have to get my dogs together. I'm going to have to pack up the car. I'm going to have to plan. I'm going to have to reschedule all this stuff. And then when I get there, I'm going to have to listen to my stepdad talk about boring stuff. And then my brother's going to, and my sister-in-law." So there's typically just not a lot of excitement about going and engaging in this social engagement. Now, if she calls and she says, "Hey, come to this holiday dinner," and I'm like, "Yeah, sweet, this is gonna be great. I'm gonna go and talk to my stepdad about, this stuff, and my brother's there, and my sister-in-law, she's gonna be great. It's gonna be great to see them. I'm just excited." And so all the work and all of all the stuff that normally would be a deterrent really doesn't even become a factor when our left hemisphere is highly activated to this and we're seeking social engagement. The other thing is receptivity to positive regard and also your ability to provide yourself with positive regard. So receptivity to positive regard is this. So if I'm talking to someone and I say, Hey man, I really appreciate you. I think the world of you. You're a wonderful person. If that person has a bunch of alpha in their left hemisphere, it may be very difficult for them to, one, hear what I said to them, two, believe that what I'm saying is true, and then three, internalize that. It may be very difficult for them to go, oh yeah, Scott thinks I'm a wonderful person. I really appreciate that. That's wonderful. And then feel good about me saying that to them. So when people have this elevation of alpha, they really struggle with receiving positive regard, and then also they really struggle with providing themselves with positive regard. So I complete a task, I go and I work with someone and I'm very successful, or I build something and I'm really successful, and I kind of sit back and I think to myself, "Wow, that was really great. Scott, you did a really great job." Or I just allow myself to feel that good feeling. So when people have that elevation of alpha, they really struggle with those kind of behaviors or those systems. So this can cause depression. So when I don't feel as though I can get appreciation or respect from the world around me, that actually makes me feel depressed. It makes me want to withdraw from the community. It makes me feel not disconnect, or it makes me feel disconnected from people around me. And really what we know about depression is that the antithesis of depression and also shame is really connection. Okay, so the other side is the beta. So when the right hemisphere has a lot of beta, and this one pops up probably about 98% of the time with complex developmental trauma. Um, yeah, just pretty much every one of my kiddos had this one. And what this is self-deprecation. This is I'm not good enough. I'm not a good person. I'm not lovable. If you're adopted, my parents abandoned me. So I must not be worthy. It's a lot of, pick your poison at that point. Really, what is it that, what self-deprecation did this person develop and are they maintaining? So a couple things happen here when we have this self-deprecation. One is that we tend to withdraw and isolate. We tend to, not want to be in the world. We want to be in our room. We want to be away from the world. That's one, and that contributes to depression. Again, the same thing, disconnection from other humans. Another thing is we tend to project that worth into the world around us. So, if I'm, standing there with someone and I have this beta in my right hemisphere, and I think, let's say I think I'm not smart. Like that's my self-deprecation. I'm not a smart person, or I'm a failure. I fail at everything. Those are my self-deprecating thinking thoughts. So what I might think is that that other person that I'm talking to also thinks that. They also think I'm a failure, and they also think that, I'm not intelligent. So we tend to project our self-deprecation into the world around us. So again, that contributes to the disconnection from the world, the withdrawal from the world. Everyone around us is threatening because they're all judging us as being not intelligent and a failure. Okay, so with developmental trauma, there's a couple other iterations here. One is that people who have this elevation of beta in the right hemisphere tend to seek out unhealthy relationships. The reason for that is that if I don't believe I'm a good person, I'm not really going to want to spend time with healthy people because, relatively speaking, that's going to make me feel worse about myself. So, the example I give here is, if I go to my high school reunion, 20 years out, and I haven't really lived up to anything. Let's say I'm just someone who like lives at home and doesn't have a job and I don't know, plays video games and does drugs all the time. Like that's what I do. Then when I go to my high school reunion, I'm going to feel one, I'm not probably not going to want to go in the first place, but if I do go, I'm just going to feel lesser than everyone else. So if I go there and people are like, I'm an IT specialist, or I'm a doctor, or I'm I don't know, pick a job. And so I'm going to feel less than because those people are successful and I'm not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find people that are also like me. I'm going to find people that also, aren't really living up to their potential. I'm going to find other people that also think they're failures. And I'm going to spend time with them because I feel more accepted by the unhealthy relationship than with the healthy relationship. Now, the kind of worst case scenario here, and this happens with a lot of developmental trauma, is that not only am I going to be attracted to unhealthy relationships, but in those unhealthy relationships, I am going to put them down. This is our bullying. So I'm going to put them down. I kind of make a joke about this because I feel like this is some like residual like baboon DNA that humans still kind of have. But we have this maladaptive self-regulation where when we put other people down, we feel better about ourselves. And so a lot of times when we feel like a failure or we don't feel intelligent, we go around and we try to make other people feel like failures, and we try to make other people feel unintelligent. So it's kind of like a reverse projection. Or I guess it still is a projection, but it's more of, well, I guess it would be more of a displacement. I'm putting my self-deprecation onto you. Okay, so anytime I see these metrics, usually I ask about depression, and more often than not, there is some depression going on. Okay, let me speed up here because we're about halfway through and I still got a bunch of stuff. All right, so cognitive emotional checklist. This is so when we do brain scans, we do what's called a cognitive emotional checklist, and this is basically a subjective evaluation about your attention, memory, impulsivity, depression, anxiety, and filtering. And the reason that we want to get subjective information, your report, what you think about yourself, is because what we can do is we can compare that subjective information to the qEEG. We can compare it to the biomarkers. So so what that looks like is a couple things. One, it helps to increase the probability that a particular symptom exists. So if you say, in the CEC, like you say, okay, yeah, I have attention problems. I really struggle focusing, and I don't have motivation. And then we also see biomarkers in the brain that say, okay, yeah, some of the attention systems are impacted and impaired. We would expect that this person would be experiencing attention problems. Well, that's great because now we've got two pieces of information, two pieces of data to indicate that this is probably the thing that we want to work on. So with that, we also can look at the mismatches. All right, so you say, I have attention problems. I struggle paying attention, especially in boring situations and scenarios. I can't really pay attention very well. But then when we look at the brain doesn't have any indication of impairment within with the attention systems. Then what that means is we've found a mismatch, meaning that most likely your symptom is going to be related to a perception, meaning that maybe, I don't know, all your life, people just told you had attention problems, even though maybe you didn't have attention problems. And so you just have this perception that you have attention problems, but really you pay attention rather well. Two, it could be a learned behavior. A learned behavior would be, well, if I present myself as distractible or distracting, then it somehow serves a purpose. And attention dysregulation can serve a purpose as like, it can serve a purpose related to like therapy. I'll give you examples. So like if somebody comes in and they sit down on the couch and I talk to them for a little bit and then I ask them to start talking about something that's really painful. Hey, remember that really painful event that happened? Can we talk about that? Distractibility might be really useful here. What they might do is they might say, "Oh, look, there's a dog out there. Let's go pet that dog." So they might use distractibility as a defense against talking about painful things. So in that case, attention dysregulation becomes very useful. The last potential thing could be that it's something they never learned how to do. Attention is something that can be a learned skill. I kind of put myself into a position, where I'm forcing myself to pay attention for long periods of time. And so eventually I just develop that as a behavior. I know how to pay attention. I know how to pay attention to things. So then what that means is when we review this qEEG and we see the matches, so let's say we see a match for you think that you have attention problems, and also the scan is saying that you have attention problems, we know that that's coming from the brain. And this becomes incredibly useful because for two reasons. One, because we know that the intervention to improve your attention has to be physiological in nature. Okay, so there's often kind of this criticism in the mental health world that there's no outside, indicators of mental health conditions. So you say you're depressed, but why don't you just stop being depressed? And a lot of times people have that particular perspective because there's no indicators. Unlike, let's say you got a broken leg. We see the broken leg. We know there's a problem. So what this does is it allows us to basically identify physiological correlations to mental health conditions. So now we know that depression is going to be a thing that you're struggling with. So that does two things. One, it helps parents let go of their expectations, unreasonable expectations. So again, if I have, attention problems and my frontal lobes don't work, it's going to be really difficult for me to pay attention. So if I'm a parent and I keep saying, "Hey, pay attention," and I'm, hitting you on the side of the head, "Pay attention," then really what I'm doing there is I'm just causing you more shame. So it'd be like if, let's take the broken leg example. If you had a broken leg and I'm like, "Hey, I need you to get up and run around this track." And you're like, "I can't do that." And I go, "Just get up and run." I smack you on the side of the head. Well, that would be an unreasonable expectation for that person because they have a broken leg and they're in a cast. So what this helps me to do is it helps me to navigate what type of symptoms really require a lot of acceptance. Meaning, if your child has attention problems, it's going to be really important that you provide a lot of acceptance around that. Otherwise, what you can eventually do is you can cause shame, like the broken leg situation. Now, two, we also know that the intervention that we're going to want to use is something physiological, which means neurofeedback, medications, getting your sleep down, diet, all those things are going to impact the physiology. So we know that the intervention is going to be physiological in nature. Now, let's say that the attention problem there is no biomarker for it, but we're seeing that you personally say, "I do have attention problems." Well, okay, so now we're going to work on perception, learn behaviors, or maybe you didn't learn how to do that. Or in some cases, there may be what's called an implicit memory that's contributing to that, which really is going to impact your perception. So if your mom or dad just complained about how you were never paying attention enough, you might have a perception about that. And really, what you're going to want to do here is you're going to want to do more therapy, more mindfulness, more kind of curiosity. Why do you not pay attention? You're going to want to apply those particular modalities and interventions to that. Okay, I think I got everything here. Let's go on to the next one. Oh, yeah. So with the qEEG, we can also do comparison reports. So I can do a pre-qEEG and a post-qEEG. So I can do a qEEG before you do neurofeedback and then after. And then we can see how your brain has changed. So we can see overall change in plasticity, which is, has the brain changed? Do we see something shifting? Do we see some part of the brain reconnecting? Um, Typically, when we see change in plasticity, that's a really good sign. In some cases, when there's too much change, that can actually be problematic because you don't want the brain to change too quickly because that could create a lot of chaos or internal kind of dysregulation. And with that internal dysregulation, you can get a lot of defense structures to come up. Um, I had a situation a long time ago where we were working with a kid and we were employing a new neurofeedback protocol, and we ended up training this kid too much. Um, and too much training can basically activate a lot of defense systems. So this kid then, after the training, went down into the milieu and caused a big fight because when you change the brain too quickly, that can create a sense of vulnerability. Now, with this normalization over here, this is the good biomarker. This is basically saying, okay, you like normalize 50% of your brain. Usually when we see comparison reports and there's this type of percentage, that's really good. That means the brain is moving more towards normal. So it's moving more towards that statistical norm of the qEEG. So very good when we see that. All right, so let's get into neurofeedback. So this is the main brain-based intervention that I utilize. Neurofeedback is basically it's a what's called a BCI, which is a brain-computer interface. So over here in this picture, you can see that I've got some sensors on this fellow's head. There's some sensors on his ears. So the way neurofeedback works is we're using the qEEG to identify areas of the brain that have dysregulation. We're targeting those different areas with one sensor or two sensors, but we're approaching it with the assumption that in the qEEG, those are just averages, meaning that when we look at the qEEG and there's an elevation of theta, that's just the average. That means that 80% of the time, your brain is probably producing a lot of theta, which means you're going to be distractible. You're probably going to be very internally aware. You're not really going to be paying attention to the outside world most of the time. It doesn't mean that you cannot pay attention to the outside world. It just means that The majority of the time, you're paying attention to the inside world and you're distracted. Okay, so we can measure that in real time, and actually the brain will oscillate in real time. So to give you an example, um, most of the time, 80% of the time, the brain is going to be producing about 20 microvolts of theta. Okay, so most of the time it's producing 20 microvolts of theta. Every once in a while, it's going to start to produce 15 microvolts of theta or 10 microvolts of theta. It's going to go towards normal because we know 10 microvolts of theta is normal. That's what most people of your peers produce. Okay, so every once in a while, it's going to drop down to 10 microvolts of theta. Every time that your theta drops down to 10 microvolts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that brain-computer interface to measure that in real time. And then every time your theta drops, I'm going to provide you with some feedback. And the feedback can look like a bunch of different things. It can look like a bell, like, okay, every time you drop the beta or the theta down, a bell tone goes off. You get a ding. So literally just operant conditioning here. Every time you drop down the theta, you're going to get a bell. Ding, ding. Now, in some cases, what it can look like is it can look like a video that's playing. And every time you start to drop down that theta, the video plays. Every time that theta drop goes back up to that 20 microvolts, which is what we don't want, which is your kind of your normal brain functioning, the video stops. So what we're doing here is we're just going to be operantly conditioning the brain to change the way it functions. So we're going to reward and condition brainwave frequencies. So I'll show you an example. Okay, so this is what kind of a session will look like. So for some of you who are interested in doing neurofeedback, this is basically what it looks like. You just go into a session with someone, you sit in the chair. That screen is usually what you'd be watching, and that laptop over there is going to be what the clinician is using. And basically, you just kind of sit in a chair watching a screen. Now, yeah, sorry, lost my thought. I'll just keep going. Okay, so what we're seeing here is this is going to be the clinician screen, and this is not going to be all that important for you guys, but you can see that here's the EEG. We're coming from one of the sensors. Here's going to be our instruments down here. So this is going to be the power output of each frequency that we're looking at. This is just going to be a trend graph. So over time, we're going to see, okay, does that theta increase or does that theta decrease? Are we seeing a treatment effect? So this is just a bunch of the clinician's information. But here's what a student or client or a person would be experiencing. I have a Minecraft video in here just because a lot of the kids that I work with like Minecraft videos. So the way this works is basically, I don't know if you can hear that, but just kind of notice the chunkiness of the video. So you see how it starts to go a little bit and then how it stops, starts to go and it starts to stop. So basically what's happening here is as the person is producing that low theta, the video is going to move. And as the person produces high theta, the video is going to stop. So we know that if you do this for a period of time, the brain eventually picks up on that information and then will slowly change its behavior. Okay. All right, so I got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to shoot through this last 10 minutes here, but we're going to do a case study. This is a case study on what I like to call the scattered attention. So if you guys are interested in learning more about scattered minds, you can check out Gabor Mate's work. He has this wonderful collection of information about how ADHD and distractibility are related to trauma, developmental trauma, basically in the examples that I gave earlier, where we talked about, if you're in a situation or scenario where you want to avoid your pain, it becomes really, really useful to be distracted. Same thing, if you're in an ongoing situation, let's say you're a child and maybe your parents, are in domestic violence, it becomes very useful for you as a child to become distracted by things because then you don't have to pay attention to all the chaos that's going on in all around you. It basically helps you to survive. So the nervous system itself can develop attention dysregulation just as a survival technique. So the case study that we're going to be talking about is just exactly that. So we have a case of this kid named Andrew. He lived at home with his biological mother and his adoptive father. The client's biological father was emotionally abusive and occasionally physically abusive towards him, and also the wife. He left. Andrew and his mother, when Andrew was approximately 18 months of age, at that time, Andrew and his mother began living with the maternal grandmother, and he had limited contact with the biological father. So there was 4 visits a year. Eventually, his biological father agreed to terminate parental rights. After the parental rights were terminated, the stepfather adopted him. The client currently has no contact with biological father. So during these treatment periods, the client endorsed symptoms of depression, PTSD, suicidal ideation, self-harming behavior, and school refusal. Okay, so the diagnoses were basically generalized anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, attention deficit disorder. So this kid had a bunch of things going on. We're going to focus on the attention deficit hyperactive disorder because that is a symptom of the trauma that this child experienced. So here is the scan. So I'm going to go over this just a little bit with you guys. I've got some additional slides here. Whoops, nope, that's not what I want. I got some additional slides here. These are basically MRI templates with the activation of the brain really transposed onto those MRI templates. It just gives us a little bit more specificity about where the generators of these frequencies are coming from. So as you can see, yellow, we've got dark orange and red. The saturation of the color is gonna be an indication of severity. So we've got a lot of alpha, we got a lot of theta, and we got a lot of delta. So these are all slow waves. Delta is sleep. So walking around with delta basically means that your brain is asleep. It's kind of like cognitive delays. If you guys didn't get sleep last night and you're trying to pay attention to me, it might be hard to pay attention to me because you have some of this delta lingering in the brain. It just makes everything more difficult. Theta, this is going to be internal awareness. This is really going to be distractibility, disassociation. So if I'm in a painful situation, I'm just going to disassociate or distract myself. Elevations of alpha are really going to be about the brain just really isn't, it's just not online. It's just in this very neutral place. It's just kind of checked out, if you will. So attention becomes really problematic when you have a bunch of slow wave like this. So a couple things. If we look over here at the theta, we can see that the theta is predominantly in the frontal lobes. Frontal lobes have to do with decision making, have to do with positive regard, engagement, depression, attention regulation, prioritization. All those things happen in the frontal lobes. So when you have a lot of slow wave theta in the frontal lobes, you're not really getting a lot of that. Making decisions is going to be hard. Prioritizing is going to be hard. Staying focused is going to be really hard. All those things are going to be really difficult when you have that elevation of theta. Okay, so let's go forward. So we created some protocols here. These are the neurofeedback protocols that we did. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about these because we don't have much time here and I wanted to get to the end. But basically, we're training the frontal lobes. This F here is F3, F4. This basically means we're training frontal lobes. And then we're also training the parietal lobe, which has to do with more sensory systems. So we're training the front of the head. We're trying to activate it. We're trying to get betas to come online. And we're trying to get these thetas to drop down. Okay, so we did that for 24 minutes and then 15 minutes over here in this PZ protocol. All right, so then we got to look at the data again. So we did another qEEG, and this was after about 20 sessions. So 20 sessions of I just did the reveal there. 20 sessions of neurofeedback. So what we're seeing over here in the slow wave is we're seeing that alpha frequency drop down considerably. So you see this gray means that it's normalized. Gray means normal. So we're not seeing as much severity in the alpha frequency anymore. This kid is waking up, okay? He's being able to engage in the world around him. He's able to function, be socially engaged. He's not so disassociated and disconnected. We're seeing the theta drop down, which means focus attention is improving. His decision making is improving. Still, delta's still high, so there might be some sleep dysregulation. And that could be hygiene too. Maybe he's not getting to sleep, or maybe he's scared at night. Something like that's going on. We still see the theta elevation. And actually, we see the theta elevation get a little bit worse here, which means we're still seeing impairments of frontal lobes. So we're going to do some more training with him. We're working with the frontal lobes again, and actually we're going to work a little bit more centrally now. So again, we're really just trying to hit those frontal lobes. We're trying to improve the beta frequency, which is focus concentration, and decrease some of that slow wave. Okay, so we do those for about 10 minutes. And then here, 20 sessions later, what we see is we see the normalization of the alpha frequency with a little bit left in the right hemisphere. We see the normalization of the theta frequency, and we see a little bit of the delta being impacted here. But over here with this theta, we're seeing that completely go away. So this kid is able to pay attention now. He's able to focus. He's able to be engaged. His therapist is now saying that he's responding to therapy. He's engaging his family therapy with his mom. All sorts of improvements are taking place here, just with this training. Okay, so this is a great example. So up at the top here, this is going to be his subjective report of his overall distress. So the higher the number goes, the more subjective distress this child reports. Okay, so the higher number. So he starts at like 70, things kind of get worse, and then slowly they get better, and then eventually you see this line right here. This is what we call the clinical cutoff, which basically means that if you go below this clinical cutoff, it means that you're doing really well. Like life is great. So a lot of your symptoms have remediated. It's really good when subjectively you're able to identify that you're below this clinical cutoff. So what I have here is the three qEEGs in linear fashion here. Top is going to be the first one. So that was done at the very beginning. And we can see all that elevation of alpha and theta and delta. Then about the middle of the way, we see, kind of actually where he's experiencing a lot of distress. And that's pretty typical. When people start to get better, they start to experience more distress, especially when it's complex developmental trauma, because you've spent so much time ignoring or suppressing that as you stop ignoring and suppressing emotions or memories, it actually floods your system. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing some dysregulation, but actually the brain is coming online. So even though we're experiencing this dysregulation, we're still seeing the brain come online. And then the last one was done kind of over here at the end here. So he's able to identify, yes, I am subjectively experiencing less distress. And then we're also seeing that in the qEEG in terms of the normalization. Now, what the great thing about this is we were able to actually ask the parents about her observation of his distress. And so here we got this wonderful overlay where the blue line is going to be his perception, and then the kind of light purple is going to be the mom's perception. So actually the mom was initially saying, yeah, like things were really intense here, like we're up at 120. And then over time, we get this data point here, and then it falls down below that clinical cutoff, which would be an indication that the mom is also identifying that her child is also improving. So we're seeing subjective report improve, we're seeing biological report improve, and then the interpersonal report improve, meaning that people are actually observing these changes. This was the overall change in plasticity. So we got a 50% normalization overall and a 39% change in plasticity with this kid, which is just fantastic. Okay, thank you. All right, I got 2 minutes left. So maybe we have one question that we can. I know that was a lot of information, guys. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start with Chelsea. So we can't make official diagnoses with brain mapping. We try to stay away from that typically. There are people in the psychiatric field that are kind of moving in that direction, but as a neurotherapist and mental health counselor, I don't use it as diagnosis. Okay, so the next one is, what would be the name of the test that needs to be performed in order to know if there is something wrong with the brain or is subjective? Okay, so that would be a qEEG, the name of the test. The particular database that I use is called it's called New Mind Maps. And New Mind Maps was designed by a man named Richard Suter, Dr. Richard Suter, and he's the one that developed that assessment. So the CEC comparison to the EEG. Okay. Oh, somebody's mentioning the float tanks. Yeah, you do. If you are a large person, you want to go into a large tank, and they do have they'll have like what's called cabins. So also if you're claustrophobic, you go in the cabin. So you go into this very large cabin with a very large tub. And actually sometimes you can do two people at once in these large tubs, which can be interesting. But if you're like 6 feet tall or really tall, then going into these large cabins can be really useful. If you are claustrophobic or your mind goes 100 miles per hour, I would suggest doing a couple of them, like either probably 3 or 4 of them, because the first time you do it, it's gonna be really uncomfortable and really weird. The second time you do it, you're gonna start to settle in. The third time you're gonna do it, it's gonna be amazing and awesome because you're gonna be able to shut off your mind. The other benefit of the float tank too is that it helps to release a lot of, muscle, tension in your spine, so you kinda come out of there, feeling just, like, taller. It's a great thing. Yeah, I highly recommend the tanks. Looks like a bunch of you talked about that. Yeah, so, for Kevin, there is a bunch of research out there that shows that neurofeedback can impact seizure. There's a guy by the name of Barry Sturman. He does a lot of work with, I don't know if he's kinda older now, but there's probably people that are doing this, but they've got a bunch of research articles about seizures and, medication resistance. But if you've got good medication, then that's spot on. But if you wanted to kind of investigate the seizure activity and maybe start to train some of the seizure activity to regulate itself without the medications, you can reach out to some of these guys. There's a neurologist in Texas